On May 5, 1821, on a volcanic rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the man who once made Europe tremble was reduced to begging for a chamber pot. Napoleon Bonaparte, emperor, military genius, the terror of kings, was dying in the most undignified way imaginable, writhing in agony, vomiting black bile, his legendary iron will broken by something as mundane as stomach pain. This is Napoleon Bonaparte, the military genius who conquered most of Europe, only to end up a prisoner on the world's most remote island. The man who rewrote the map of continents now can't even leave his bedroom without permission. So how does the most powerful man in the world end up dying like a laboratory rat, observed and documented by his enemies? Was this just a tragic case of stomach cancer, or was it something far more sinister? A slow-acting poison administered by the very people who claim to be his protectors. Before we dive into this imperial tragedy, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your location in the comments below, whether you're in Paris, where he once ruled London, where they plotted his demise, or somewhere in between. The story of how the mighty fall resonates across every empire, including our own here in America. It turns out that conquering Europe is the easy part. The hard part is surviving your retirement. And as we're about to discover, when you've made enemies of every crowned head in Europe, even exile comes with a particularly lethal kind of hospitality. The story we're about to tell isn't just about the death of an emperor. It's about how the world's greatest powers learned to commit the perfect crime. To understand why the British were so absolutely terrified of one man on a rock, you first have to understand the world that Napoleon had torn apart and rebuilt in his own image. By 1815, this Corsican artillery officer had spent 2 decades turning European politics into his personal chess game, with kings and emperors as his pieces. He'd redrawn borders like a child with a crayon, and every time the old powers thought they'd finally beaten him, he'd stage one of those miraculous comebacks that made his enemies wake up in cold sweats. The Battle of Waterloo had finally ended the game, but Europe's leaders were taking absolutely no chances. To understand their paranoia, imagine if a certain Austrian with a mustache had actually won World War II for a decade, had a habit of escaping from imprisonment, and possessed a charisma that could turn peasants into revolutionaries with a single speech. That's the level of existential dread Napoleon inspired. The Congress of Vienna wasn't just redrawing maps, they were trying to Napoleon-proof the future. So they chose St. Helena, a volcanic speck in the South Atlantic that makes Alcatraz look like a luxury resort. This wasn't just remote, this was cartographically ridiculous. 1,200 miles from the nearest land, surrounded by currents that could drag a ship to the bottom of the ocean, and blessed with weather that oscillated between oppressively hot and bone-chillingly damp. It was the kind of place where even the most optimistic rescue mission would end up as fish food. The British government was spending £12,000 a year to keep Napoleon there, more than most lords' entire incomes. They weren't just imprisoning him, they were investing in his misery. Every ship that approached the island was searched, every letter was censored, every visitor was interrogated. The paranoia was so intense that they appointed a governor whose primary qualification seemed to be an almost pathological ability to make life unpleasant for famous prisoners. Enter Sir Hudson Lowe, a man whose name sounds like it was invented by a novelist with a grudge against middle management. Lowe was the kind of bureaucrat who could turn paradise into purgatory through the sheer power of paperwork and petty regulations. His job description was essentially make sure the most famous person in the world stays alive but wishes he were dead. And judging by what happened next, he was terrifyingly good at his job. Napoleon arrived on this godforsaken rock expecting at least the courtesy due to a fallen emperor. What he got instead was psychological warfare disguised as hospitality. He was housed not in a palace, but in a damp, mold-infested colonial farmhouse called Longwood, where the walls literally sweated and the rats treated the place like their personal kingdom. The British had managed to find the one spot on Earth where even exile felt like an insult. But Napoleon, being Napoleon, initially tried to maintain his imperial dignity. He established a court in exile, complete with elaborate rituals and ceremonies that must have looked absurd to anyone watching. Imagine a former world conqueror insisting on being announced for dinner in a house where the dining room ceiling leaked. It was tragic and slightly ridiculous, which pretty much sums up the human condition. His loyal followers had chosen to share his exile Count Bertrand, who'd followed his emperor into voluntary imprisonment, and the mysterious Montholon, whose motives would later become the subject of some very disturbing speculation. There was also Dr. Barry O'Meara, an Irish physician caught between his duty to his patient and his obligations to the British authorities, a position that would soon become impossible to maintain. From the very beginning, something was wrong. Within months of his arrival, Napoleon began experiencing the first symptoms of what would become a 6-year death sentence: severe stomach pains, inexplicable weight loss, and a growing paranoia that his food was being tampered with. At first, everyone assumed it was the stress of captivity and the tropical climate. After all, plenty of Europeans had sickened and died in far-flung colonial outposts. But as the months turned to years, and the symptoms grew more severe and more bizarre, a darker pattern began to emerge. What unfolded next was less a medical mystery and more a slow-motion execution disguised as natural causes, and documented with the meticulous attention to detail that only the British civil service could provide. The story of Napoleon's final years unfolds in 3 increasingly sinister acts, each more disturbing than the last. If you're enjoying this peek behind history's curtain, and let's be honest, who doesn't love watching the mighty fall, smash that like button? It helps more history lovers find these stories, and it costs less than Napoleon's monthly wine budget. Our first act begins with what we might generously call the gilded cage. Though calling Longwood House gilded would be like calling a prison cell a studio apartment. Napoleon's initial shock at his living conditions was almost comical, if you ignore the existential horror of it all. Here was a man who'd slept in the palaces of Vienna and Madrid, now assigned to a house where the wallpaper was literally peeling off the walls, and the dampness was so pervasive that books molded within weeks. But Napoleon, being Napoleon, decided that if he was going to be a prisoner, he'd at least be an imperial prisoner. He maintained elaborate court rituals that must have seemed surreal to his British observers. Every morning he'd hold a levee, a ceremonial waking up routine, as if he were still at Versailles instead of on a rock in the middle of nowhere. His servants would announce visitors with full titles and ceremony, creating a bizarre theater of dignity in a setting that was anything but dignified. Hudson Lowe, meanwhile, was busy perfecting the art of bureaucratic torture. Every request Napoleon made was met with forms, regulations, and committees. Want to take a walk beyond the prescribed boundaries? Fill out a form. Want to send a letter to your family? Submit it for censorship. Want to be addressed by your imperial title? Sorry, you're just General Bonaparte now. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, administered by a man who'd turned petty tyranny into performance art. The psychological warfare was relentless and increasingly creative. Lowe would show up unannounced for inspections, demanding to see Napoleon personally to verify he hadn't somehow escaped. These encounters were masterpieces of mutual hatred, with Napoleon maintaining imperial hauteur while Lowe wielded the power of bureaucratic procedure. Imagine a chess match where one player is trying to maintain dignity while the other keeps moving the board. But beneath this theater of mutual contempt, something more sinister was happening. Napoleon began experiencing severe stomach pains, waves of nausea, and an inexplicable fatigue that seemed to worsen with each passing month. His famous energy, the force that had once allowed him to work 18-hour days while managing a continental empire, was slowly draining away. He'd attributed it initially to the stress and the climate, but as the months wore on, a darker suspicion began to take root. By 1818, we enter our second act, the slow decline. Napoleon's health had deteriorated to the point where it was affecting his appearance, his mental state, and his ability to maintain even the pretense of imperial dignity. The man who'd once commanded armies was now struggling to get through a day without collapsing. His weight was dropping dramatically, his skin was taking on a sickly pallor, and he was experiencing episodes of vomiting that left him weak for days. The most troubling development was the mysterious dismissal of Dr. O'Meara, the Irish physician who'd been treating Napoleon since his arrival. O'Meara had committed the unforgivable sin of putting his patient's health above British policy, publicly stating that Napoleon's condition was being worsened by the climate and living conditions at Longwood. The British government's response was swift and telling. They removed O'Mara from the island and replaced him with doctors who would be more cooperative with official policy. This is where the story takes a decidedly sinister turn. Napoleon's new symptoms were not just severe, they were bizarre. Hair loss, severe sensitivity to light episodes of delirium, and a pattern of gastric distress that didn't match any known tropical disease. More disturbing still, Napoleon himself began to voice suspicions that he was being poisoned. In letters smuggled off the island, he wrote of his conviction that someone in his household was slowly killing him. His response to this growing paranoia was both practical and poetic. He began dictating his memoirs with an urgency that suggested he knew time was running out. These weren't just historical recollections. They were his attempt to control his own legacy to ensure that his version of events would survive, even if he didn't. It was as if he understood that his death would be as much a political event as a medical one, and he was determined to have the last word. Which brings us to our final, most disturbing act, the final torment. By 1821, Napoleon's condition had progressed beyond anything that could be explained by conventional illness. His body was betraying him in ways that seemed almost designed for maximum suffering. He was experiencing severe abdominal bloating. His skin had taken on a jaundiced yellowish tinge, and he was losing hair at an alarming rate. Most troubling of all, he was vomiting a dark, coffee-ground substance that contemporary doctors couldn't explain. The new British doctors, who'd presumably been selected for their discretion as much as their medical skills, found themselves confronted with a case that defied their understanding. Napoleon's symptoms didn't match any known disease pattern, yet they were progressive, severe, and ultimately fatal. The patient himself was convinced he was being murdered, but the doctors could find no evidence of any conventional poison. On May 5, 1821, after 6 years of this slow-motion deterioration, Napoleon Bonaparte finally succumbed. His final words reported by witnesses were about poison, and his son, a man obsessed with the idea that he was being murdered, calling out for the child he'd never see again. It was a death that managed to be both pathetic and somehow still magnificent, the final performance of a man who'd spent his life turning everything into theater. The British response to his death was tellingly swift. Within 19 hours, an almost suspiciously short time in tropical conditions, Napoleon was buried in an unmarked grave on the island. No autopsy results were published for public scrutiny. No independent medical examinations were permitted. The British had spent 6 years meticulously documenting Napoleon's life in exile, but when it came to his death, they suddenly developed an aversion to paperwork. But here's where our story transitions from narrative to investigation, because the official explanation for Napoleon's death, stomach cancer, has never quite satisfied everyone who's looked closely at the evidence. And when you start digging into the details, some very disturbing questions begin to emerge. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are now opening the cold case file on Napoleon Bonaparte. For 200 years, historians have argued about what killed the emperor. The official British autopsy concluded he died of a cancerous tumor in his stomach. Case closed, nothing to see here, perfectly natural death of a man in his early 50s. But tonight, we examine the evidence that suggests this conclusion was less a medical diagnosis and more a cover story. Let's start with what the British wanted everyone to believe. Napoleon died of stomach cancer, a disease that could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. It was tragic, yes, but entirely natural. The great Napoleon had simply been unlucky enough to develop a fatal tumor during his exile. This explanation had the virtue of being medically plausible and politically convenient. No one could be held responsible for cancer. But when you start examining the actual evidence, the official story begins to develop some rather significant holes. Let's open our first exhibit and see what the science tells us. Exhibit A is perhaps the most damning piece of evidence in our entire case: the arsenic. In 1961, a Swedish toxicologist named Sten Forsjövud got his hands on a lock of Napoleon's hair and subjected it to modern chemical analysis. What he found was shocking arsenic levels 13 times higher than normal. This wasn't just a little arsenic, the kind you might pick up from environmental exposure. This was enough to kill a horse, administered slowly over time. Now arsenic is what we might call the perfect murder weapon of the pre-industrial age. It's colorless, odorless, and when administered in small doses over time, produces symptoms that perfectly match what Napoleon experienced: stomach pain, vomiting, hair loss, skin discoloration, and eventual death. Even better for potential murderers, chronic arsenic poisoning could easily be mistaken for a variety of natural illnesses, particularly in an age before sophisticated toxicology. The discovery of arsenic in Napoleon's hair sparked decades of investigation and debate. Some historians argued that the arsenic came from the wallpaper at Longwood House, which was decorated with a green pigment called Scheele's green that could release arsenic gas in damp conditions. This theory had the virtue of explaining the arsenic while maintaining the fiction that no one was deliberately trying to kill Napoleon. But here's the problem with the wallpaper theory. It doesn't explain the pattern of Napoleon's illness, the timing of his symptoms, or the extraordinarily high levels of arsenic found in his hair. Environmental arsenic poisoning typically produces different symptoms and occurs at much lower doses. What Napoleon experienced looks much more like deliberate systematic poisoning. Exhibit B takes us into the realm of forensic medicine and reveals just how suspicious the circumstances of Napoleon's death actually were. The official autopsy conducted by British doctors with a vested interest in avoiding international incidents was rushed incomplete and suspiciously lacking in detail. More troubling still, key organs and tissue samples disappeared after the examination, making independent verification impossible. Contemporary witnesses reported contradictory accounts of Napoleon's body. Some described severe bloating and discoloration consistent with poisoning, while others claimed he looked peaceful and natural. The British authorities made sure that no independent French or neutral doctors were present during the autopsy, and they buried him with almost unseemly haste 19 hours after death in tropical conditions, where preservation would have been possible for much longer. But perhaps most telling of all, they buried him in an unmarked grave and refused to allow his remains to be returned to France for nearly 20 years. This wasn't respect for the dead, this was the behavior of people who had something to hide. Exhibit C explores the one question that any criminal investigation must answer: who had motive, means, and opportunity? And when you look at the political situation in 1821, the answer is both obvious and chilling. The British government had invested enormous resources in keeping Napoleon alive but imprisoned. But by 1821, their investment was becoming increasingly problematic. Napoleon was still relatively young and healthy enough to potentially escape or be rescued. Worse still, his presence on St. Helena was becoming an international embarrassment, with foreign governments and humanitarian organizations beginning to criticize his treatment. A dead Napoleon solved all these problems. He couldn't escape, couldn't be rescued, and couldn't continue to embarrass his captors. Better still, a Napoleon who died of natural causes would become a historical footnote rather than a martyr. The British had every reason to want their prisoner dead, and they had complete control over his environment, his food, and his medical care. Hudson Lowe's career depended entirely on ensuring that Napoleon never left St. Helena alive. If Napoleon escaped or was rescued, Lowe would be the scapegoat. If Napoleon died of apparent natural causes while in his care, Lowe would be seen as having successfully managed a difficult situation. The incentive structure was designed to reward Napoleon's death and punish his survival. Exhibit D presents perhaps the most disturbing evidence of all the timeline of systematic abuse that preceded Napoleon's death. This wasn't just imprisonment. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological and physical torture designed to break down his health and his will to live. The British systematically isolated Napoleon from the outside world, censored his correspondence, denied him adequate medical care, and subjected him to a daily routine of petty humiliations designed to strip away his dignity. They housed him in a building that was literally toxic, damp, moldy, and decorated with arsenic-laced wallpaper. They denied him proper exercise, adequate nutrition, and basic respect. But most tellingly of all, they documented everything. The British kept meticulous records of Napoleon's daily activities, his health, his mood, and his decline. These weren't the records of jailers caring for a prisoner. They were the notes of scientists observing a specimen. The pattern that emerges from these records is clear, systematic, methodical destruction of a human being carried out with the cold efficiency that only a bureaucracy can achieve. Whether the arsenic was environmental or deliberate, whether the medical neglect was intentional or just callous indifference, the result was the same: the slow, documented death of a man whose only crime was being too dangerous to live. So what is our cursed chamber in this story? It's not a room or a building, it's the entire island of St. Helena, a 47-square-mile prison designed not just to contain Napoleon's body, but to slowly crush his spirit and eventually kill him. Whether through poison neglect or systematic psychological torture, the British had created the perfect murder weapon, a rock in the ocean where the world's most famous man could die, slowly observed and documented, while his killers maintained plausible deniability. The genius of the St. Helena solution was that it allowed the British to commit murder while maintaining the fiction of civilized behavior. They weren't executioners, they were jailers. They weren't poisoners, they were providing medical care. They weren't torturers, they were maintaining security. It was the perfect crime, dressed up as humanitarian detention. Based on the overwhelming weight of circumstantial evidence, the verdict in the case of Napoleon Bonaparte is clear. His death was the result of a systematic campaign of abuse that included possible arsenic poisoning, deliberate medical neglect, and psychological torture. Whether his jailers intended to kill him outright or simply didn't care if he lived or died, the result was the same: the murder of a prisoner under the guise of lawful detention. But the real tragedy of Napoleon's death isn't just that he was probably murdered. It's that his murder was carried out by people who convinced themselves they were acting morally. The British officials who designed and implemented the St. Helena solution genuinely believed they were protecting European civilization from a dangerous madman. They saw themselves as the good guys doing what was necessary to prevent another war. This self-righteousness made their crime even more chilling. They didn't kill Napoleon in a moment of passion or revenge. They killed him methodically, bureaucratically, with forms and procedures and medical reports. They turned murder into paperwork, atrocity into administration. It was evil disguised as professionalism, and it set a precedent for how great powers would deal with inconvenient enemies for the next 2 centuries. The ripple effects of Napoleon's death were immediate and lasting. In France, his martyrdom helped fuel the romantic nationalism that would eventually bring his nephew to power as Napoleon III. The legend of the emperor dying in chains became more powerful than any military victory he'd ever achieved. The British had intended to end the Napoleonic threat by killing Napoleon, but instead they'd created something far more dangerous: the myth of Napoleon as a martyred hero of democracy and nationalism. More broadly, the St. Helena precedent established the modern template for dealing with captured enemies of the state. The techniques pioneered there: isolation, psychological manipulation, medical neglect disguised as care, and the creation of conditions designed to break down prisoners physically and mentally would be refined and perfected by every major power over the next 2 centuries. But perhaps the most profound lesson of Napoleon's death is what it teaches us about the nature of civilization itself. The British officials who killed Napoleon were educated, cultured gentlemen who attended church, loved their families, and saw themselves as defenders of Christian civilization. They weren't monsters, they were ordinary people who'd convinced themselves that their extraordinary cruelty was justified by their noble cause. Napoleon's death reminds us that the greatest atrocities are rarely committed by obviously evil people. They're committed by respectable citizens who've persuaded themselves that their victims deserve whatever happens to them. The cursed chamber of St. Helena wasn't just a prison, it was a monument to humanity's infinite capacity for self-deception in the service of violence. The man who'd conquered Europe died alone on a rock, poisoned by his enemies and abandoned by his friends. But in death, he achieved something that had eluded him. In life, he became immortal, not as the emperor who'd redrawn the map of the world, but as the prisoner who'd reminded us that power without accountability is just organized cruelty. 200 years later, we're still grappling with the questions his death raises about justice, civilization, and the price of keeping dangerous people alive. His story is a chilling reminder that sometimes the cruelest victories aren't won on battlefields, but in hospital rooms where enemies can watch their greatest threats waste away while maintaining the fiction of civilized behavior. What do you think? Was Napoleon murdered by arsenic, or was he simply the victim of 19th century medical ignorance and British paranoia? The evidence suggests the truth is probably darker than either explanation alone, that he was killed by a system designed to destroy him while maintaining the appearance of legality. It's a death that tells us as much about the nature of power as any of his victories, and a reminder that history's greatest monsters often wear the masks of civilization.